doing long-winded introductions. Most of the people presenting from the Presidential Libraries are my counterparts, the different education specialists around the National Archive system. We did have a deputy director speak yesterday, Robert Hausweitz from George H.W. Bush Library. But Jeff is at the FDR Library there in Hyde Park. And Jeff, you've been there probably about 20 plus years now, I would say.
Yeah, a little over 20 years.
Just guessing that. So
I've worked here 10, but I've been here about 21.
Yeah. He's done about 10 years of work in 20 years. So I'm going to mute myself, which Jeff is going to enjoy. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and he's going to present for us today and continuing our theme on the presidents and the Constitution. Turn it over to you, Jeff, and good morning, and thanks for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you, Mark, for having me. This is always a great conference. It's awesome when we can be together, but kudos to you for pulling together, even though we're having to do it virtually. Also, my hat is off, my hair is off to you teachers. It has been an incredible year for you all. I feel for you. I understand what you're up against from an educational standpoint and also from a parenting standpoint. So good work, you guys. Who'd ever thought you'd be teaching in the middle of a global pandemic? But you really pulled it off. So that's great. So I am at the Roosevelt Presidential Library. Actually, I'm at my home right now because we're not open yet. We're opening for a few hours a day starting next week into what they call phase 1. So ordinarily, I would be in this building here, and I don't have a screen where I can see myself here. So I'm not sure what I'm showing you. Oh, there it is. So this is the building that started it all. This is the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, built here in Hyde Park, New York, at a cost of $376,000. And this is the nation's first presidential library. The concept of libraries themselves for these presidents started with George Washington. He never got around to building one. And so when he died, the concept died until Roosevelt. So what is cool about this is, by connecting to these presidential libraries, you're connecting to literally millions and millions and millions of pages of documents. I know we have 17.5 million in our collection. And I think the National Archives, who is our, parent company here, has something like 40 billion, something like that. So, we've got lots of primary sources for you folks to work with. And today I have the honor of talking about one of my least favorite topics, which is what a lot of people call court packing. And that I say it's my least favorite topic because I don't like calling it court packing. It was the Judicial Reorganization Act is what it was. Okay. Some Republican, coined the court packing thing, and that is what has stuck. But what it really was an attempt by Franklin Roosevelt to add additional justices to the Supreme Court, aka packet, so that they would be beneficial to his New Deal programs. And so what I would like to do today is to talk a little bit about what happened with that. And you can get into the nitty-gritty details of the particular cases and how the court ruled on the cases and what the court was looking at and that sort of stuff. But I'm not so sure that's what you want to do in the classroom. So the way we've been talking about the Judicial Reorganization Act over the last couple of years has been to sort of draw out the big lessons of what it was all about. So that's what I would like to do for you today, to draw out some of the big lessons and then talk a little bit about what actually happened and the step-by-step procedure of how that went down. I'll show you some documents that you can use if you want to bring these into the classroom. We have a fantastic curriculum guide on our website. If you go to our website, we did a conference about maybe 10 or 12 years ago, the presidency and the Supreme Court, and we had Sandra Day O'Connor who was our keynote speaker, and we recorded her talk, and then I broke it down into sections. So if you want to, let's say, talk to your students about Plessy versus Ferguson, you can go to that curriculum guide. You can pull in that one section, that 2 or 3 minutes where Sandra O'Connor is talking about Plessy versus Ferguson. What she does is she gives a history of the court. So each of these sections is a little broken down section. You can just play that 2 or 3 minute section. Highlighting on that, or you can play the whole, 45 minutes or whatever it was that she talked to you about on that particular day. So the documents I'm going to show you are available at the curriculum guide on the website. There's some primary source documents there. There's questions that relate to that and such that you can look at and preview on your own. But I want to first start by drawing out some of the big lessons about what this thing really was. Basically, the court packing incident or idea, I think, really falls into the category of one of Roosevelt's biggest mistakes. Right up there with Japanese American internment, which I'll be talking about later on in the week. This was a mistake that President Roosevelt did. He probably should not have done it. He didn't really need to do it. It was really a blatant power grab, when you take a look at it. And it didn't work. And it's probably a really good thing that it didn't work. So and you could argue with me and maybe you have a different perspective on that, but I take the attitude of this was not a good thing for Roosevelt to have done, because what it did was it was a blatant power grab, and it also politically backfired on him. He kind of won ultimately the victory, but he lost the little battles along the way that did have an impact on the rest of his presidency, throughout the additional terms. So let's take a look at this first. The court packing lessons that come out of this can be kind of broken down into 3 categories. The first is that this talks about checks and balances. As you all know, super important in the Constitution, the idea of checks and balances, separation of powers. What's the difference? Well, separation of powers means that you can do certain things. Checks and balances means that you have to have the approval or cooperation of somebody else to do that. The way I always explain it to students is if I was throwing a tailgate party and I put you in charge of chips, right? And I'm going to get the soft drinks and the beverages. Then what would happen is that's a separation of power. I'm getting the soft drinks, you're getting the chips. So that's a separation of power. Where it becomes a check and balance would be, I tell you to get the chips, but whatever you do, don't get Pringles. Because my sister had a really bad experience with Pringles once, and it's just not good. So that now this is happening now is it's really more of a check and a balance, because I'm impeding your ability to get those chips. Or if you say, well, okay, get soda, but don't get diet soda, now that's we have to kind of work together on that. So I always like to point that out with students, because I don't always think that they get that. But the court packing incident was really a question of checks and balances. And so I think it can be used to teach the importance of the checks and balances in our system. It was also, so that's number 1. Number 2 was, it was a classic case of presidential overreach. Franklin Roosevelt got full of himself, he got punch drunk, and he just overreached. I think he realized that shortly after the whole thing began, and he certainly realized it as his administration went on, because the political ramifications of it continued to kind of come back and bite him in the butt a little bit, throughout the rest of his presidency. So it was a checks and balances issue. It was a clear case of presidential overreach, and it also underscored the importance of the courts. And what I mean by that is, when you read the Constitution, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, there's Article 2, which is this big section about the Congress. Article 1, the big section about the Congress. Article 2, kind of a medium-sized section about the president. And then, Article 3, which is just 2 or 3 sentences, that there's going to be other, courts as Congress from time to time shall ordain and establish. That is the legal precedent which gave President Roosevelt the right to do this, to ask for this expansion of the court. So when Roosevelt tried to expand the number of justices on the court, there was nothing illegal about that. There was nothing wrong about that. It was something that is there in Article 3, given to the through the Constitution as a way to establish and create courts. So, I think that needs to be very clearly a point made to students that, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was doing something kind of not so smart, but he wasn't doing anything wrong. The Constitution allows that to happen. And by doing this, he underscored really, I think, the importance of how important the courts are. And I think that that's one of the real lessons that we need to understand for today. As I talk about the court packing and the Judicial Reorganization Act, one of the things that I'm trying to keep in mind is the current connection. And we've seen the court being played out over the last couple of years. I'm not getting political here. I'm just simply stating the facts, right? So, we have this court now that is getting up there in age, or was getting up there in age, and there were folks that were going to need to retire. So the ability of the president to appoint those justices, super duper important. And this has long lasting impacts, which a lot of people don't realize. They think of the Supreme Court and they don't really realize the fact that once these guys and gals are on there, they're on there for a really long time, like the rest of their life. And so they're going to have influences and impacts well beyond the political term of the particular president. So I like to use the court packing idea here as an opportunity to highlight checks and balances, presidential overreach, excuse me, and also the importance of the courts. So let's take a look at checks and balances. As you know, the Constitution lays out this idea of the three branches of government. They're supposed to be sort of co-equal branches. President Roosevelt, during his presidency, increases the power of the executive branch, increases the power of the presidency, in part through legislation, and also in part through, pure and simple tradition. So whereas the Congress is this big chunk in the Constitution, because that's who the founding fathers wanted to have making most of the decisions, right? Let's put the largest chunk of power with the largest group of people who are the most representative, at least in theory, because they are elected directly by the people of the states. Then we'll have this president that we have to have somebody to do this. So we'll give him a certain amount of power, or someday perhaps her, and then the courts will be there to sort of balance out the differences. So this is really important, because what this did was, when Roosevelt expanded the idea of the executive power through his presidency, certainly starting off with the first 100 days, where he comes in, and it's the most legislative actively period in American history. The Democrats are swept into office in 1932, and then again in 34, and then again in 36. So he has basically taken over control of the Congress, because he has an overwhelming Democratic majority in the Congress. So now he's got 2 out of the 3 branches of government kind of in his pocket. So by trying to add additional justices to the court, what he really was doing was trying to get that part of the government in his pocket as well. Okay, so he was, trying to pack the court there. He was using a mechanism, as I said, set forth in the Constitution, by the founding fathers, to be able to do this. So he wasn't doing anything that was especially sneaky. And over the course of history, the court had expanded and contracted to have a varying number of justices. If you go to the curriculum guide, you can find this cartoon by Herb Block, and this talks about the expansion and contraction of the Supreme Court over time. And it's got these cute little pictures of the justices sitting here. It's got the dates down the side, and then it's got a little poem underneath each of these. And I'll read that to you, so we can do that. In 1789, this is called Precedent for the President. 1789, Congress decided at first to fix the number of justices at 6. 1801, Congress planned on a change to 5, Out of the six remained very much, but the six remained very much alive. So they're going to take it down to 5, but they kept it at 6. 1807, 6 high judges, supreme as heaven, and Jefferson added number 7. 1837, 7 high judges, all in a line, 2 more added, and that made 9. 1863, 9 high judges were sitting when Lincoln made them an even 10. 1866, 10 high judges, very sedate. When Congress got through, there were only 8. And then 1869, 8 high judges who wouldn't resign. Grant brought the figure back to 9. And then the final thing is 1937, would a justice feel like a packed sardine if the number was raised to, say, 15? All right, so it's a cute little story, a cute little poem that shows, how the court has changed over the course of time. The other thing was that, it really was this opportunity for Roosevelt to try to get control of the legislative branch. And this you have to understand in the context of the time. This scared the living bejeebies out of many, many people. We're talking 1936, we're talking 1937. We see in the Soviet Union a dictator. We see in Germany the rise of a dictator. We see in Italy the rise of a dictator. We see the government in Japan pushed aside and taken over by a military junta, basically. So this idea of leaders grabbing power that didn't ordinarily belong to them or didn't ordinarily fall within their purview was something that was very much on the minds of people. They saw this happening in other places, and now it appeared as if President Roosevelt was looking to do that as well. So that's the checks and balances part. In terms of presidential overreach, basically what happened was Roosevelt got politically punch drunk in 1936. He got this huge majority. It was the largest electoral victory going all the way back to Monroe. And the Democrats were swept into office as well in the Congress. And so he had basically cornered the market on those two. The other thing that was a presidential overreach about this was that this was a uniquely un-Rooseveltian thing to do. What Roosevelt usually did when he was planning on doing something major was he would begin to talk about it. He would talk it up. He would talk about it in speeches. He would talk about it in conversation. He would make sure that it got into the newspaper so that by the time he actually channeled that into a proposal, people had heard it. People had heard from this. They were familiar with it. This was a situation where this came as a total shock and surprise when FDR announced this to Congress that he wants to expand the court. Then he brings it to a fireside chat and he explains to the country, here's what I want to do. I want to expand the court. This came as a shock to people. The number of justices on the Supreme Court had only been mentioned one time in the 1936 election. It was not a political issue. It was not a campaign issue on either the Republican side or the Democratic side. So when Roosevelt just kind of comes out of the blue, 4 or 5 months after the election to say, oh, by the way, here's what I want to do with this, it struck people, it shocked people, and it caught people off guard because it wasn't the usual Roosevelt way of doing things. Now, why he did it like this, I think, is anybody's guess. It may have been because he didn't want it to be a campaign issue and to become a big, talking point. I think he was waiting to see maybe how the election went to make sure that he had the votes that he needed in order to get this thing passed as well. But he certainly did not talk about this leading up into it. So it came as a bit of a shock for people who both thought it was not a good idea and also for people who thought that it was a good idea. The biggest problem with this overreach from a political standpoint was that it solidified the opposition against Roosevelt. Up to this point, President Roosevelt had his detractors. The conservative, right-wing folks hated him. He's a traitor to his class. Some of them wouldn't even mention his name. They would refer to him as that man in the White House. But once this occurred, what this did was both people on the left and people on the right got a wake-up call. They got a slap in the face to say, wow, you know what? This isn't good. This goes against really pretty much what the founding fathers wanted. Yes, they put a mechanism in the Constitution that allows this to happen, but this is clearly a guy who is doing this to try to gain most control over the government. And so what this did was people who trusted Roosevelt, it gave them pause to think, well, how have we misplaced our trust, or how much trust have we put in this guy? And people who didn't trust him, it underscored the fact that he couldn't be trusted. So it gave common cause to the political left and the political right. And it helped them to begin to kind of work together on this. It also showed that the New Deal was coming under an attack. And basically, historians will talk about the first New Deal and the second New Deal. We've been beginning to get away from that kind of over the last 10 or 15 years. But you can think of it as the first New Deal and the second New Deal. The first New Deal were these things that were passed in the early time, and these were emergency measures. They weren't always completely well thought through, but they were emergency measures. The president asked for them, the Congress passed them. Give you an example. The Bank Act took 8 hours to go through the House, through the Senate, back to the president's desk for signature. That's how much of an emergency measure this thing was. So once the Roosevelt began to try to pack this court, what this did was it made it so that the New Deal had to mature, so that it was no longer these first aid emergency measures. Now, when this legislation was being produced, now when this legislation was being proposed, it had to be more clearly thought through, because it wasn't going to just be slapdash passed and then everybody accepted. The courts were now going to really step up as that other co-equal branch of the government and take a look at these things. So what it did was it helped to mature a lot of the New Deal programs. It also showed, the third thing, this importance of the courts, that the court decisions mattered. Okay, if the court backed what you were looking to do, that was important because it meant that it stayed. If the court didn't back it, that was important because it meant it had to be reworked, and it meant that it had to be redone. Now, I know that this sounds obvious to you as a social studies teacher, but this is something that people had begun to really forget in Roosevelt's time, because he comes in, and again, in that first 100 days, he passes 16 major pieces of legislation. It got to a point where it was just like, well, this is what they do. The president proposes things, the Congress passes them, he signs it, and off it goes. This reinstated, in a way, the importance of the court as sort of a referee or a person who needed to take a look at this. It also showed that the court was not as politically isolated and insulated as people tend to think it is. Today we talk about there being a conservative court or a liberal court, and this really underscored that fact in that time. There were justices who leaned to the left, there were justices who leaned to the right, and your ability to put these justices on there really for the first time really became I don't want to say a litmus test, but almost a litmus test of how you were going to rule once you got on the bench. Prior to that, it had always been sort of in the background, but this really drew it to the forefront. And as I said, it helped to make sure that the New Deal tightened up. So the legislation that you see after 36, 37 is much tighter, much more complete, much more well thought out legislation than you see in the first New Deal. Give you an example: the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which gets declared unconstitutional in its original format, has to be reconfigured and reworked, and then ends up going to be reworked and repassed and re-signed, and then was okay in terms of the way that worked. So that's the overarching lessons that need to be learned from this: checks and balances, presidential overreach, importance of the courts. And in today's context, as you have, judicial appointments for the court being held up for a year in the last year of a president's term, as was seen with President Obama, or, justices being rushed in, within a week or two of an election, or a president leaving office, as we saw in the last 6 months. This really underscores and brings back this idea that what's going on with the courts now politically, what's going on with the courts now from a dynamic standpoint, and a turning of the country in a direction, is not necessarily new. This is the same sorts of things that were going on during the Roosevelt administration. So let me give you an overview now of how this kind of played out in the way that it worked. And then what we'll do is we'll open it up to some questions and answers. So initially, the court lent its support to the New Deal. The country was in crisis. The president was showing some dynamic movement, getting these things passed, getting these things signed, getting the country moving again. And all the way up through the 34 election, the court was pretty much either staying out of it or rubber stamping what it was that the president was looking to do. But this was based upon a very narrow margin. And in 1935, Owen Roberts shifted to a more conservative viewpoint. So from 32 to 35, he was in favor and just kind of going along with what was going on with the New Deal. But as the New Deal programs began to build, as the country began to gain some stability and began to actually make some progress, getting back on its feet, he began to think, well, maybe we don't need such a dramatic way of going about this. So on Black Monday, which was May 27th, 1935, the court ruled against the National Recovery Administration and the Federal Farm Bankruptcy Act. And what FDR did was he condemned the justices as a horse and buggy court. So basically, the court begins to stake its ground with the National Recovery Administration. And that, in fact, along with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, were the two sort of bellwether programs that were declared unconstitutional by the Constitution that really, got Roosevelt thinking, wow, these guys are turning against me. I need to do something to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So Roosevelt laid low during the campaign. As I said, he only mentioned, the problem with the court as he saw it one time during the campaign. And as he saw his two cornerstone programs, the NRA, National Recovery Administration, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, struck down by the court, he began to become more and more worried. So he set out to change that. Now, he didn't want to go a direct approach and say, look, these guys are voting against my stuff, so I want to change, the makeup of the court. He came about it in a sort of a sneaky sort of a way, and he based it upon age. And he said that, the court justices were getting too old. The average age of the court at that time was 71. 6 of the justices were over 70 years old. And there was a book that came out by Drew Pearson and Robert Allen that referred to the justices as the 9 old men. So this began to create this drumbeat of these guys are old, they're out of touch. And in fact, many of them had been placed on the court back during what was called the Lochner era, which was an era during which the courts took a very laissez-faire approach to government intervention. That that there was much of the law needed to be worked out through contracts and through business, and the government should keep its hands off the regulation, let the market mechanisms work this stuff out, let the the natural ebb and flow of business and pricing and that sort of stuff, let that stuff handle itself. And so these justices that were on the court came from that era. And so when they saw Roosevelt coming in with all of these, labor reforms and, wage reforms and, business restrictions and these sorts of things, it was very much against their nature of what they were looking to do, or the way that they thought government should respond. But what this did was it put the court at loggerheads with what most of the American people wanted. So Roosevelt was building on this idea of, look, I've just got this huge mandate. Right, I've been reelected in this huge electoral victory. We've picked up seats in the Congress. This is what the country is asking for and begging for, and so I need to be allowed to do this. Whereas the justices were thinking, well, that's not really the way that it's supposed to work. You have to work with us to get these sorts of things done. So what happened was this was what it was based upon. It was based upon this idea that the court was getting too old and they were falling behind in their legislative duties. This was simply not the case. And the court was able to prove this showed that, in fact, many of the delays were coming from the lower courts, not from the Supreme Court, but that the Supreme Court was, in fact, handling more cases than it usually does. And so that they were not overworked, they were not overbooked, and the age of 70 did not play into the progress of the court. So what happened was Roosevelt shifted tactics, and he said, all right, well, rather than change the nature of the court, then what I'll do is I'll just add one justice a year for every year these guys go over the age of 71. And so now he's shifted it from, let me just add 6 all at once, to I'll add a slow progression over the course of time. Well, what happened was, over 168 days from the time he mentioned this to the time that it actually died in committee, this whole court packing issue unfolded over just in 168 days. And there was a great number of people that were in favor of it, and there was a great number of people who were opposed to it. Those that were in favor of it tended to be the dyed-in-the-wool New Deal supporters. Those that were against it tended to fall into 2 categories. One category was people that opposed the New Deal, which doesn't, come as any surprise. And the other was a group who believed that Roosevelt was overstepping his bounds. And even within that group, there were some who believed that it was probably okay for Roosevelt to do that, because having gotten us through the Great Depression so far, they had trust in him. But to change the mechanism at this point, to set this huge precedent of adding 6 justices to the Supreme Court, pretty much all in one fell swoop, would not be a good precedent for people who followed Roosevelt. You may not be able to trust the guys who come down the road after this. And so there was pretty evenly divided footage between those that supported it and those that opposed it. And I've got a great number of documents that you can look at and show students. I'll just hold some of them up here. There were letters to the editor, and you can find these all with the curriculum guide. People that were in favor of it, and there were people that were against it. And what's interesting about this is, again, this split between people who say, well, I trust you to do this, but I don't trust the next guy. I don't trust the guy who comes down the line to be able to do this. My favorite way of talking about the court packing is to show it through political cartoons. So here we have this thing that says these 6 tuplets aren't doing so well. And it's the 6 justices that the FDR wants to add to the court. Okay, so he's got these guys down here. And all these people are taking pot shots at it. So here comes the Supreme Court packing scheme, and the states are taking a shot at this. The Congress is taking a shot at this. Farmers are taking a shot at this. People are not supporting this. And you see that through this particular cartoon. Here's another one where you've got the Supreme Court, and they're shooting down the NRA Eagle. And you can see them doing this. And what's interesting about this is President Roosevelt. He's got a stretcher at the beginning, and in the back is the Speaker of the House, Richardson. And this guy was promised to be the next appointee if Roosevelt was able to appoint people to the court. Roosevelt had promised this guy Richardson that he would be the guy. He was the Speaker of the House, and he would be the guy that was going to be the guy that was appointed. However, as time went on, Roosevelt lost confidence in this guy to support the New Deal. And so what Roosevelt did was he painted himself into a corner by promising this guy who was able to provide the votes necessary to pass this legislation, that once we pass this legislation, you'll be the first guy that I put in. So this just speaks of really kind of creepy deal making, and was really not a good thing in terms of passing the stink test, basically. So Roosevelt takes it to the fireside chats, and he goes and he puts the, turns the heat up on the Congress, right? So he's throwing the coal in here, and he's putting the heat on in the Congress to put the pressure on the Supreme Court, all right? That we need more justices here in this. Here we see the president fishing, and he's got some support for this, but now there's overwhelming public support not to do this. So the public protests are coming in here, and they are, going to be swallowing this up, as the case may be. Here is one that relates to his expression of it being a horse and buggy, court, where the administration has got it on here, and they're pulling it with a vehicle, and the old horse and buggy court is coming along that way. So we talk about this, and it speaks, and has a big place in Roosevelt history as this big court packing idea. But it really was only a prominent thing in and of itself for about 3 or 4 months. And what happened was, prior to this being put through the Congress, this Richardson guy, who Roosevelt had promised would be the first next justice, had a heart attack and died. And so what happened was that freed Roosevelt up from having to appoint him to be the next justice on the Supreme Court. And what ended up happening was the bill was sent to committee, where it died and never saw the light of day. So Roosevelt was able to get what he wanted, because there was also a shift on the court in terms of direction that some of the folks had been looking at. They used to refer to it as the Four Horsemen: Justice Butler, Sutherland, McReynolds, and Vandevanter, who were sort of the folks that were vehemently opposed to the New Deal. And Owen Roberts was a swing vote on this, as was Evan Hughes. And so as these guys began to switch and lean more toward the New Deal side, more liberal side of the court, the need for going forth and changing the substance of the court began to die off. So the problem kind of solved itself by having the what they call the switch in time that saved 9, by Roberts beginning to vote in favor of some of the New Deal programs, sort of coming to terms with this idea that, well, maybe Roosevelt is right in the fact that he did win this huge landslide, and maybe we do need to be a little more receptive to what the people are saying. Maybe we are too much of this old way of thinking, going back to the Lochner era. So there's some speculation that what Owen Roberts was doing was taking a look at the sort of saving the court, basically, by saying, well, if I read into this what the election said, and if I vote my conscience and go with this because I think the president has this mandate, and I think that some of these other justices are outdated in their thinking, this will allow the president the opportunity to continue with his program, and he'll back down and back off of this attempt to pack the court. And that will in turn solidify the sanctity of the court with the 9 justices, and not having this added bunch of justices. So that's the way that I would approach this. I would look at it from a checks and balances standpoint, a presidential overreach standpoint, and the importance of the court's standpoint. The courts are especially the Supreme Court, is far more important than many people give it credit to or credit for. And so what the court packing did, it was only 168 days out of the American history, but what it did was it helped to mature the New Deal. It helped to reinstate the prominence of the courts. It helped to galvanize political support against President Roosevelt, and it also helped to put in check a president who was punch drunk from an overwhelming majority in the '36 election, and was looking really to push the boundaries of what it was that he was able to do, or really probably should be doing, given the nature of the situation in the states at that time. So I'd like to open it up to questions and answers now, if you have any questions. I'm looking in the chat. I see history repeated itself as President Biden has created a commission to examine increasing the number to 13. Absolutely. And I'm not saying that's a good idea. I'm not saying that's a bad idea. But what I'm saying is it's not an unprecedented idea. And I think that if you're going to talk about that, as we are going to over the next couple of years, in our classes, that we need to be able to keep it in perspective and to look at it in terms of this this time in the 1936-37 period, where Roosevelt was looking to do this as well. When I see these people make these calls, oh, we should just expand the court, that really scares me. That really scares me, because there is a mechanism to do that, which is constitutional, but it's not something that should be done all willy-nilly. Okay, where can we find the poem or cartoon about the number of justices shown near the beginning of the talk? I believe I have that in my curriculum guide. If you go to our website, go to the Supreme Court curriculum guide, it should be there. If it's not, email me and I can send you a link to that. Oh, somebody's saying it's not in the guide. So where did I see that? Okay, just then send me an email, Jeff Urbin at the Roosevelt Presidential Library, and I will send you a link to that. Let's see. After FDR stopped using the age issue, how did he explain adding 6 more justices? Well, the idea of that was he didn't need to add 6 more justices. Then what he wanted to do was, rather than add 6 in one fell swoop, he wanted to add 1 justice at a time from that point on. So this was him sort of backing off of this. He knew that he shocked people. Like, wait a minute, okay, if you want to expand this, if they're falling behind, you want to expand this a little, that's one thing, right? But you don't go from 0 to 60. You don't go from, from 9 to 15 or 16. If you want to add a justice or 2, as has happened in the past, that's fine. But what happened ultimately was that Roosevelt was able to appoint 8 Supreme Court justices over the course of his presidency. That is more than anybody except for George Washington, who appointed, more than that. So he ultimately got what it was that he wanted, but it was a really messy political, and I wouldn't put it at a level of a constitutional crisis, but certainly it was something that that was analogous to a constitutional crisis, in the sense that, given the political environment and atmosphere that was going on at the time, it was not unheard of for people to think that maybe he was trying to take over the government in that way. Okay, of course, he had 4 terms. Let's see. Do you have any insight regarding the impact of the circumstances of the era upon these choices, i.e. the Great Depression and the popular perceptions regarding the rise of autocrats in Europe and elsewhere? Yeah, this was something that that people were really worried about. This was not, and what's interesting about this is that, when people like Hitler and Mussolini and these kinds of folks, first started taking power, they took power legally. They used the mechanisms of the government to do this. Getting yourself appointed, as chancellor, having the laws changed, having the laws passed. It was done within the confines of what the political structures were at the time. And that's why this looked like Roosevelt was sort of following that same sort of pattern. You know, the Constitution says, yeah, you can have justices if you want, but it doesn't say do it simply because, you know, they're voting down legislation that you're putting forth. It doesn't say do it simply because, you know, you want to, you know, control all three branches of the government and therefore screw up the delegate balance between, you know, the separation of powers and the checks and balances. So this was not an unheard of idea for the president to do this, and for people to think, you know, maybe he's pulling a Hitler, maybe he's pulling a Mussolini in what he's doing with these things. And some of the folks that did this, that wrote into him, again, take a look at this, and they say things like, look, it's not that we don't trust you. You know, we trust you, Franklin, but we don't trust who's going to come after you. You know, you have to look at it as this is not something that can be easily done or simply done or passively done by you, because it creates the opportunity for the next guy to do it. And we don't know who the next guy is going to be. Went to the Union Station in Kansas City this past weekend and saw the traveling Auschwitz exhibit. They had a ballot for Hitler on display. It was really impactful and hit hard that he was that he truly was elected. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't until afterwards that these, you know, I mean, obviously he was not a nice guy to begin with, but, you know, the way that these folks went about this, they kept within the confines of the way it was supposed to be done for as long as they could to create as much legitimacy as they could. And people feared that Roosevelt was doing that same thing. And I'd like to say that that he wasn't. I don't think he was looking to be a dictator, but he certainly was looking to have his New Deal programs not overturned. So that was the idea there. Did this raise any questions about the tie between popular opinion and justices' legal opinions? For example, if there's an overwhelming popular support for programs in the court gets in the way for good legal reasons, was there any discussion on mechanisms to move past that? Is that just a constitutional amendment? Well, that's where Owen Roberts comes in, because he was the guy who really took a look at this and said, you know, what Roosevelt is asking me to do is not so far beyond what I think should be done. And I think that he saw his ability to make those votes in favor of New Deal programs as opposed to against in the context of two main things. Number one was the overwhelming popular support that Roosevelt had and that people seemed to be expressing for the New Deal programs, and the fact that they were working, number one. And number two, that 4 or 5 of the justices had come out of this Lochner era, which was a complete and totally different mindset of the role of government. Roosevelt had come in and had changed the perception of the role of government. So it was really, you know, the court was kind of locked in the last way of thinking, and Roosevelt had this new way of thinking. And I think that Owen Roberts saw that and was kind of trying to skirt the issue a little bit and make a bit of that that transition. Now, whether or not he should have done that, whether or not he was, you know, right in doing that is a debate for another time. But again, it goes down in history as what they call the switch in time that saved 9, because by doing that, it gave the court a little bit more balance, and it showed that there wasn't a need to do this extreme measure that Roosevelt was pushing for. During the 18th, 19th century, presidents typically added Supreme Court justices as the country expanded. When the country and population were growing, presidents tended to add Supreme Court justices. Justices at this time also had to ride circuits, right, on horseback in the same areas that they work. Today, justices no longer ride circuit. The judiciary is the only non-democratically elected or appointed branch of American government. Once the court is packed by appointees based on political party, the court becomes a partisan body acting in line with partisan control, and we can no longer claim ourselves a sound and healthy republic. Would you agree? Yes and no. Yes and no. I think that clearly the appointment of these justices does have a political overtone. I mean, the president knows, when they appoint these people, pretty much who they're getting to. There's only been a handful of people who have kind of turned out to be different. I think Eisenhower, and you can ask the Eisenhower education specialist, was once asked, do you have any regrets? What's your biggest regret? And he said, well, I have two of them, and they're both on the Supreme Court. There were people that he had appointed thinking were going to be more conservative leaning and ended up not being more conservative leaning. So I think that you do have a bit of a slant in that way. However, the cases are generally, I think the folks that have been on the Supreme Court have been of high moral character and are looking at these things from the standpoint of the letter of the law and maybe not the letter of the law, because there's judicial activism and judicial conservatism, but they're looking at the merits of the case, let's say, and they're deciding based upon the merits of the case. Now, whether or not that case can advance an agenda or not advance an agenda is a different issue. But the fact that I think that these guys were looking to do that, by and large, over the course of our history, would lead me to not agree with your statement. I think the best way that we might be able to get around this would be maybe not by adding Supreme Court justices, but by maybe making their terms set. So maybe what you do is set a Supreme Court justice's term at 18 years, let's say, 18 or 20 years. So you're on for a horizon. You don't have to worry about the political atmosphere, being reelected, or any of that sort of thing. But there is a time when you are going to come off that court. And by having this set time period, whether it's 16 years, 18 years, 20 years, what that would do is it would ensure kind of a regular cycle of these guys and gals coming through, as opposed to basing it simply on longevity and the fact that you put a batch in and they all kind of get older at the same time and then drop off at the same time. So it would at least add a little more of a cycle to the whole thing. Okay, the riding on the horse of circuit justice, not Supreme Court justice. No, so these guys, a lot of this is this idea of these guys cut their teeth coming up through the courts and through their career. And then once they get on the Supreme Court, then they're free of having to worry about trying to advance their careers or build their careers. So they're able to base it on the merit of the particular case. And again, I don't go into a lot of detail when I talk with this about students as to, what the case was that, or what the particular point was that the Supreme Court overturned this case or that case. You can look that up. You can get into that. It's interesting, but I don't think students need to know that. I think the larger implementation and implication for what we're talking about is that what Roosevelt did was not illegal. It was not without precedent. It was probably more of a politically bad idea. And he probably should have thought it through more politically than from a constitutional standpoint. It was constitutionally allowable. It was politically not particularly smart. It had the political backlash of solidifying his political opponents against him. It had the constitutional impact of maintaining the balance between the three branches. So ultimately, the system worked. It didn't get, particularly tipped in one direction or the other. It did not, I don't think, rise to a level of a constitutional crisis, but it could have. And it gave us an opportunity to really think about how important the checks and balances and the balance of power actually is, so that we did not go down the road of places like Germany and Italy and some of these other countries at that time. So when you're talking about this with students over the next couple of years, as we're going to see, this tumultuous court situation going, they're trying to press Breyer to get out now, because he's too old, and give Biden the chance to, put somebody in. I don't know if that's such a good thing, that you should have that chance to put somebody in. It's one of those things where these are ideas I think we need to talk about. These are ideas I think that we need to think about. And it's kind of a thing that the founding fathers weren't really, concerning about. They were looking at, we'll put these guys on for life, whatever that means, and then, that will insulate them from the political side of this. But I think we realize that they can only be insulated from the political side so much. Just like President Washington said, oh, we shouldn't have political parties, and within no time at all, we had political parties. So it's kind of an unintended consequence, but one that we need to keep a very close eye on. And the situation going on in the country today and over the next 4 or 5 years will give us an opportunity, I think, to take a very close look at this, as we should. And this idea of court packing, or the Judicial Reorganization Act, as Roosevelt put it, gives us a historical perspective of how this may or may not be played out, and why or why not it might be a good idea. Anything else in 2 or 3 minutes? I don't want to get over on Mark's agenda. Anybody else? I would suggest you take a look at that Sandra Day O'Connor videos that we have. It was awesome when she was there. She was not a Supreme Court justice at the time. She had retired. But what was fantastic about it is she gives a real quick overview of the history of the court. And then again, we broke it down into sections. So if you want to focus on particular areas, she actually, I think, even makes reference to the poem in her talk. So, we can get you a copy of that poem. You can show your students that, and you can zero in on particular, eras or points in the history of the court. Not hearing it from me, but hearing it from a real live Supreme Court justice retiree, the first female member of the Supreme Court. So, so there you have it. All right. And again, thank you so much for everything you guys are doing in the classroom every day. And beware, because the upcoming year is going to be a tough one too. Folks like Mark, me, the other educators you've heard from, we are in your corner. We are here to help you. We are here to support you. So if you need help, if you need somebody to bounce an idea off of, if you need somebody just to complain to, give us a call, shoot us an email. We are in your corner. That is what we are here for. So, please, please reach out if you need it.
Thank you, Jeff. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Great job as always. And I wasn't being rude. I lost my connection right at about 3 minutes ago, but I managed to get back in.
No worries.
As you wrapped up. So thank you, everybody. And I dropped in the chat